When I first stepped into my boss's house that afternoon, I wasn't expecting anyone else to be there. It was supposed to be quick, drop off a few files, maybe exchange a word or two, and be on my way. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I noticed her. She was seated gracefully on the sofa in the living room, angled slightly toward the sunlight that poured in through the wide windows. Her posture was relaxed, elegant in a way that only comes naturally to someone comfortable in her own skin. She looked up at me as though she had already been expecting me, her dark hair framing her face and catching the afternoon light just enough to soften her features. I froze for a second, trying not to show my surprise. My boss's neighbor, he introduced her as, her name slipping from his mouth with a casual ease that told me she was someone who came by often. She rose from her seat, offering her hand in a gesture that seemed both formal and warmly personal at the same time. Her hand was cool at first touch, but soft, and she didn't pull away immediately. It wasn't anything unusual, not really, but something in the way her fingers lingered in mine made the air feel heavier for just a moment. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling slightly, and I found myself struggling to return the expression naturally, my chest unexpectedly tight. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but not in the careless way of youth. It was a beauty shaped by grace, experience, and quiet confidence. Her blouse was simple but elegant, ivory white against the curve of her shoulders, paired with a skirt that suggested she valued presence without trying too hard. A delicate necklace rested just above her collarbone, glinting faintly as she moved. As I sat down, I caught the faintest trace of her perfume. It wasn't overpowering, just subtle enough to make me lean in slightly without realizing it, as though my senses were pulling me closer. I tried to focus on the conversation. Light remarks about the weather, neighborhood chatter between her and my boss. But every now and then, her gaze would settle on me, steady and unhurried. It felt like being seen in a way that went deeper than just polite acknowledgement. Her eyes carried both warmth and something unspoken, a curiosity that mirrored my own. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore how aware I had suddenly become of myself, how my voice sounded, how I was sitting, even the way I was breathing. For a moment, I caught myself wondering what she thought of me. Was I just some passing face from her neighbor's office? Or had she felt that same strange flicker of awareness in the room? It was too early to know, of course, but the spark was undeniable. And all of this quiet, unexpected intensity, had only come from a handshake, a smile, and the way the afternoon light seemed to rest on her like it belonged there. The moment my boss excused himself to take a phone call, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost instantly. Until then, most of my attention had been divided, half on the conversation and half on the woman seated just a few feet away. Now it was just the two of us, and the silence between us carried a kind of weight that made me straighten in my chair without thinking. She turned slightly toward me, crossing one leg over the other with a quiet ease that suggested she was perfectly comfortable being left alone in a stranger's company. I could feel my pulse pick up. Her eyes, dark and steady, held mine for a fraction longer than expected before she spoke. "You work with him, don't you?" she asked, her tone light but carrying that subtle curiosity I had already noticed in her earlier. I nodded, suddenly aware of how young I might seem in her presence. "Yes. I just started not too long ago. Mostly running files, helping where I can." She smiled, a small curve of her lips that felt more genuine than polite. "I thought so. You carry yourself differently. Not like the ones who've been worn down by too many years in the office." Her words hung there for a moment, teasing but not unkind. It was strange how quickly conversation flowed from that point. She asked about my studies, what drew me to this kind of work, and listened without the half-distracted air that so many people carry in casual exchanges. Her attention was full, anchored. And when she spoke about herself, about moving into the neighborhood, about her love for books and long evening walks, it felt less like small talk and more like the opening of a window, a glimpse into her world. I caught myself leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on my knees, because I didn't want to miss a word. Every so often, her hand brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so natural it shouldn't have mattered, but somehow it drew my eyes. There was something quietly vulnerable in the way she spoke, especially when she admitted she spent more time alone than she would like. "This house of mine feels too big sometimes," she said softly, almost as though she hadn't meant to let it slip. I found myself answering more honestly than I expected, telling her how I understood that kind of loneliness, even if mine looked different at my age. For a few seconds, the air stilled, and there was only the soft hum of the air conditioner, the faint clink of teacups on their saucers, and her gaze, steady on mine. The corners of her mouth curved into the kind of smile that feels shared, like a secret between two people who have known each other longer than just a few minutes. And in that moment, with the late afternoon light warming the room and her laughter lingering softly between us, I forgot entirely that this was supposed to be just a routine stop at my boss's house. The conversation had started lighthearted enough. Jokes about the neighborhood, about how my boss seemed to keep the busiest schedule on the entire street, but somewhere along the way, the mood shifted. It wasn't forced. It was more like a current quietly pulling both of us into deeper waters. She was leaning back now, her arm resting along the back of the sofa, her posture relaxed, but her voice had softened. "You know," she began, eyes fixed on the rim of her teacup, "there are days when I wonder if I made the right choices." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting her to peel back the layers so quickly, especially after only just meeting. But there it was, an opening, something real. She laughed faintly, almost as though she regretted saying it aloud, but then her gaze lifted to mine, steady and searching. "I don't usually talk like this," she admitted, her tone lower now. "But sometimes, being in that house alone, it's easier to say things out loud to someone who doesn't already know my whole story." I didn't know exactly what to say. I wasn't used to someone like her, so composed, so confident, revealing something so vulnerable. But instead of filling the silence with clumsy words, I let the pause linger. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and said quietly, "Sometimes it's easier with strangers. There's no history, no judgment." Her lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile but close, as though she appreciated the effort I was making to meet her honesty with my own. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the quiet broken only by the faint hum of the city outside the window and the soft ticking of a wall clock. She shifted slightly, and the sleeve of her blouse brushed against mine. It was the smallest contact, but I felt it like a spark, unexpected, quick, and impossible to ignore. My hand rested on the sofa cushion near hers, and for a moment, her fingers hovered close, as though she had considered bridging the space between us. Her eyes lifted again, catching mine, and this time she didn't look away. There was something in that gaze that held me completely, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't bold or obvious, just a quiet gravity pulling us closer. I became aware of the details in ways I shouldn't have. The way the sunlight filtered through the curtains and painted warm lines across her face, the way her necklace shifted gently against her skin when she moved, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Every sense seemed sharper, as though the entire room had narrowed to just her presence. I wanted to say something more, something meaningful, but the weight of the moment made words unnecessary. And so I sat there, letting the silence stretch, knowing that in that silence was something far louder than speech. The quiet beginning of a connection neither of us had expected. Just when the air between us felt heaviest, the sharp sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled us back. My boss re-entered the living room, phone in hand, still mid-sentence with whoever was on the other end. The shift was immediate. Her posture straightened, her expression softened into something lighter, more practiced. I cleared my throat and leaned back slightly, pretending to glance at the stack of papers I had brought with me. The spell was broken, or at least, it looked that way from the outside. But inside, I still felt the pull of the silence we had just shared, the unfinished words hanging like smoke in the air. She handled the interruption gracefully, her smile slipping back into place as she greeted my boss again. Still, I noticed how her gaze flicked toward me every so often, almost like a secret reminder of the moment we had both just stepped out of. As my boss finished his call, she shifted in her seat and said casually, "I was actually thinking of asking for a little help with something at my place later. It's nothing complicated." Her tone was light, almost offhand, but I couldn't miss the way her eyes held mine as she said it. The words seemed innocent enough. Neighbors asked each other for help all the time. And yet, in the way she said it, there was an undercurrent that made my pulse quicken. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I wanted to imagine it. But that fleeting glance, that almost imperceptible pause before she looked away, made it feel like more. I managed a polite nod, trying not to show how much her invitation had unsettled me. My boss didn't notice a thing, too busy scrolling through his phone to catch the quiet exchange passing between us. The conversation turned back to ordinary topics, work updates, neighborhood news, but I wasn't really listening. My focus kept drifting back to her. The soft curve of her smile as she sipped her tea, The way her fingers toyed with the delicate chain around her neck when she was lost in thought, the ease with which she seemed to navigate every pause and every word. And though the room was brightly lit, full of the harmless chatter of everyday life, I felt something else entirely stirring beneath the surface. It was like standing on the edge of a current, aware of the force waiting to pull me under if I dared take a step closer. I caught her looking at me once more, just briefly. Her expression was calm, polite, even faintly amused, but in her eyes there was something quieter, more private. An acknowledgement, maybe, of what had just happened between us before the interruption. By the time my boss wrapped up the conversation, the room felt different. Everything looked the same. The sunlight streaming through the wide windows, the low hum of the city outside, but the awareness between us lingered, unspoken and undeniable. And though nothing more was said, the possibility she had planted, of another meeting, of another chance, settled in my mind, refusing to let go. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing near the tall windows of my boss's home, the files already delivered, the formalities finished. I should have been on my way. Instead, I lingered, my eyes drawn to the view of the city stretched out in front of me. The late sunlight reflected off the glass towers, casting the whole skyline in a soft, golden haze. I told myself I was just waiting politely until my boss finished whatever he was doing in the other room. But the truth was, I didn't want to leave yet. Not while she was still here. I could sense her presence even before I turned around. The faint rhythm of her heels against the polished floor, the gentle timbre of her voice as she spoke quietly to the other women still chatting nearby. Then suddenly the laughter quieted, and it was just her walking toward me. "You like the view?" she asked, her tone casual but carrying something underneath, like she already knew the answer wasn't about the skyline. I glanced at her and smiled faintly. "It's different up here. Calmer somehow." She stepped beside me, just close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed mine. Her perfume drifted toward me again, light and steady, wrapping around the moment. For a while, we both stood in silence, looking out over the city. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. The quiet felt natural, as though words would only cheapen what was already being shared in the silence. Finally, she spoke again, her voice low enough that it felt meant only for me. "I didn't get to thank you earlier for listening. Most people only want to talk, never to hear." Her words surprised me, though not as much as the gentle touch of her hand on my arm. It was nothing more than a light rest of her fingertips, but the warmth went straight through my sleeve, steady and deliberate. I swallowed, trying to keep my composure. "Sometimes listening says more than talking ever could," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She turned her face toward me then, studying me in that way she had, her gaze deep, unhurried, as if she were reading something I hadn't realized I was showing. And in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected, a softness that wasn't about confidence or control, but about longing. The sounds of the house carried faintly behind us, voices in the distance, the muffled closing of a door, but here, near the window, it felt like we were sealed away from it all. Just her, just me, and the glow of the afternoon pressing gently against the glass. Her fingers slipped away slowly, leaving behind a ghost of warmth on my arm. But the absence only made me more aware of the touch. I wanted to say something, to ask, to admit, but instead I stayed quiet, afraid of breaking the fragile thread holding the moment together. When she finally turned her gaze back to the skyline, I realized something with a certainty I couldn't ignore. Leaving that house today wasn't going to be as simple as walking out the door. The air between us had shifted again, heavier now, as though the room itself was aware of something unspoken pressing closer. I leaned back slightly against the frame of the window, trying to steady myself, but my thoughts were restless. Every word she had said, every glance she had given me since I walked through the door, seemed to point to something just out of reach. She moved closer, not in a bold way, but with the kind of ease that felt natural, like she belonged in that space beside me. Her arm brushed mine as she shifted, and though it was the smallest touch, it sent a quiet jolt through me. My chest tightened, not from nerves exactly, but from the weight of holding back something I wasn't sure I was allowed to say. "I don't usually talk this much with someone I've just met," she admitted softly, her voice carrying that mixture of strength and vulnerability that seemed to define her. "But you make it feel easy." Her words pulled me in more than I wanted to admit. I turned toward her, my eyes catching hers before I could think better of it. For a heartbeat, neither of us looked away. Her lips parted slightly, as if she was on the edge of adding something, of letting slip the very thing I had been wondering. I wanted to answer, to tell her that I felt the same, that I couldn't explain why it was so easy, why it felt so natural to be here with her. But the words lodged in my throat. Instead, all I managed was a quiet, "I'm glad." The pause that followed was filled with something more powerful than words. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the muted voices of others somewhere in the house, but here, between us, there was only stillness. Her eyes didn't leave mine, and for the briefest moment, I thought she might close the distance completely. Her hand shifted, hovering near mine on the window ledge. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, so close that I almost imagined the touch. My pulse quickened, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, as if some part of me was no longer willing to hold back. Then the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke through the silence, sharp and jarring. She pulled her hand back gently, her gaze flickering toward the noise before returning to me. The spell hadn't shattered completely, but it had been interrupted. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding my breath. She gave me a small, almost secret smile, one that said more than words could. There was acknowledgement in it, a recognition that whatever had passed between us wasn't just my imagination. And though the moment had slipped away before it could become something more, I knew, with absolute certainty, that the line we were both afraid to cross had already been drawn in the space between us. Eventually, the afternoon began to fade into early evening. My boss wrapped up his tasks and returned to the living room, offering polite goodbyes and casual conversation that made it clear my part of the day was finished. I gathered my things, though my mind wasn't entirely on the papers in my hand. I was aware of her still, seated with quiet poise, her presence filling the room in a way I couldn't ignore. When I finally said I should be going, she rose too. It felt deliberate, though she gave no sign of it, simply offering a gentle smile as if it were only courtesy. But then, when my boss turned away to check his phone, she stepped closer and said softly, "I'll walk you to the door." Her voice was calm, but it carried that same undertone I had felt all afternoon, something unspoken yet impossible to miss. We moved down the hallway together, the sound of our footsteps soft against the polished floor. Neither of us spoke at first. It wasn't silence filled with awkwardness, but rather with an awareness so palpable that it seemed louder than words. I glanced at her once, and she caught my look, her lips curving into the kind of smile that said she already knew what I was thinking. When we reached the door, she placed her hand lightly against the wood, but instead of opening it right away, she turned toward me. For a moment, she simply studied me, as if memorizing something she didn't want to forget. The golden light from the hallway fixture brushed across her features, softening the lines of her face and making her eyes seem impossibly deep. "I enjoyed this," she said quietly. "It's rare to meet someone who listens the way you do." Her words settled over me, warm and steady. I could have answered with something simple, "Me too," or "It was nice talking." But I felt her hand brush against mine as she reached for the handle, and the touch froze the words on my tongue. It was just the lightest contact, fingertips grazing skin, but it was deliberate enough to make my heart pound. "I'd like to see you again," she added, her voice even softer now, almost a whisper meant only for me. "Maybe you could come by sometime. I might need a little help with a few things at my place." The way she said it was casual on the surface, but her eyes told the truth. It wasn't about errands or chores. It was about continuing whatever this was, whatever had been quietly building between us since the moment I stepped through the door. I nodded, unable to find words that matched the weight of the moment. She seemed to understand anyway. Her hand slipped fully away from mine, opening the door at last. The cool air from outside drifted in, mingling with the warmth that still lingered between us. As I stepped out, I glanced back. She was standing there, framed in the doorway, her expression calm but her eyes carrying something far more personal. She didn't speak, and she didn't have to. The promise was already there, unspoken but clear. And as I walked away, I knew with certainty that this was only the beginning.